In the ruthless world of medieval politics, few deaths made a statement quite like the one inflicted on Hugh Despenser the Younger in November 1326. His screams rang out in Hereford as executioners systematically tore apart not just his body, but his very essence as a man. This wasn't just any execution. It was a calculated act of revenge, humiliation, and political theater that shocked even those who had seen their fair share of brutality. Hugh Despenser clawed his way up from humble beginnings to become one of the most powerful figures in England, second only to King Edward II himself. For over a decade, his influence was so great that even earls felt uneasy and queens plotted in secret. But when Queen Isabella finally decided to act, she made sure that Despenser's end would reflect the cruelty he had shown to others. The way he was executed wasn't about quick efficiency. It was all about maximizing his suffering and symbolically destroying everything he stood for. Medieval chroniclers, usually reserved when talking about violence, described Despenser's execution with surprising detail and hidden glee. They knew they were witnessing not just a man's end, but the brutal closure of one of England's most chaotic political eras. The brutal nature of his death reveals exactly how much fear and hatred he inspired during his lifetime. What turns a minor lord into the shadowy ruler of a kingdom? What kind of reign of terror warrants such a warped and sadistic execution? The story of Hugh Despenser is one of unchecked ambition, royal favoritism, and the steep price of overwhelming power. His rise was rapid, his grip on influence was tight, and his downfall catastrophic. Today we dive deep into the darkest chapters of medieval England to uncover the twisted narrative of the king's favorite who flew too close to the sun. This is a tale of how political ambition turned into a death sentence, revealing how medieval justice could be more terrifying than any torture method ever imagined. Born around 1286, Hugh Despenser the Younger stepped into a world where loyalty to the crown could either skyrocket a family to glory or wipe them off the map entirely. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had already built a reputation for the family as both skilled courtiers and ruthless politicians. The younger Hugh not only inherited his father's name but also his cleverness and dangerous hunger for power. The England of Hugh's youth was anything but forgiving. The kingdom was changing. When Edward I, the powerful Hammer of the Scots, passed away in 1307, he left the throne to his son, Edward II. The new king was nothing like his warrior father. He preferred rustic hobbies and the company of his male favorites over ruling an empire. This lack of strength at the top invited ambitious figures like Hugh Despenser to seize their moment. Edward II's reign kicked off amidst a scandal, thanks to his close bond with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight who became his closest companion and rumored lover. Gaveston's arrogance and the king's favoritism drove the English nobility mad. They felt their influence slipping away because of this foreign interloper. This fury culminated in Gaveston's murder in 1312, creating an opening perfectly suited for Hugh Despenser. Unlike Gaveston, viewed as an outsider, Despenser was pure English nobility. He had the political savvy that Gaveston lacked. Despenser knew real power wasn't about flaunting royal favoritism. Instead, it was about carving out an unchallengeable role within the existing power framework. While Gaveston sought titles and riches, Despenser craved something riskier, actual control over government. By 1318, Hugh Despenser had secured his place in the king's inner circle, often seen as Edward II's new favorite and possibly lover. But Despenser brought a level of political sharpness and ambition far beyond Gaveston's influence. He didn't just want to be the king's companion. He aimed to be the king's voice, his hand, and eventually his replacement. Despenser's rise from courtier to shadow ruler began with key positions in Edward II's administration. By 1322, he held the title of Chamberlain, giving him round-the-clock access to the king and controlling who else could see him. This role became his power base, allowing him to filter information, sway decisions, and slowly isolate Edward from other advisors. Despenser's tactics were deliberate and ruthless. He started by spotting potential threats among the nobility and methodically neutralized them using legal tricks, economic pressures, and when necessary. Hugh Despenser knew how to flex his muscle. Those lords who dared to oppose him saw their lands taken away, often based on made-up charges. Their families were thrown in jail, and their rights vanished thanks to twisted interpretations of feudal law. Despenser fixated on the Welsh Marches, those border regions usually ruled by local lords. They were rich in land and resources, and he got crafty with the king's backing. He stirred up trouble with the Marcher lords, and when they were weakened or forced to flee, Despenser swooped in to claim their territory. In just a few years, he built a personal realm that rivaled even the king's. What made Despenser truly dangerous? His savvy understanding of the legal system. Unlike other royal favorites who just depended on the king for protection, Despenser crafted a web of legal reasons for what he did. He filled the courts with his allies, rigged parliamentary meetings, and created paper trails that made his land grabs and political purges look legit. This meant his victims often found themselves powerless to fight back. By 1324, Hugh Despenser was effectively in charge of England. Edward II leaned heavily on his favorite, often making crucial decisions only after consulting him. Foreign diplomats noticed that meetings with the king meant nothing unless Despenser was around, and all the real negotiations happened behind closed doors with him. The traditional nobility was sidelined, reduced to mere observers in their own land. Despenser's era was marked by a campaign of terror against anyone who opposed him. His enemies didn't just lose power, they faced total annihilation. The Earl of Lancaster, a powerful noble and the king's cousin, was executed in 1322 for daring to challenge Despenser. That was a chilling message. Royal blood wasn't enough to shield you from the favorite's wrath. Despenser didn't stop at eliminating threats. He also made a point to humiliate and torment them. The lords who stood against him weren't just killed or exiled. They were dragged through public trials designed to strip away their dignity first. With false charges piling up, people were made to watch as their families were locked away or left in poverty. Enduring harsh punishments meant to crush their spirits before their bodies. This psychological torture often did more damage than physical violence. Despenser's network of spies reached every corner of English society. Servants in the noble houses, clerks in government offices, even members of the clergy found themselves either pressured or forced into this intelligence web. It created an atmosphere of constant paranoia. No conversation felt safe, no alliance secure. The traditional bonds of loyalty began to crumble under the weight of Despenser's watchful eye. Women weren't spared from his cruelty either. In many cases, they suffered even more. The wives and daughters of his enemies became pawns, imprisoned in terrible conditions or pushed into marriages that served his greedy ambitions. Lady Alice Deasy, one of the richest heiresses in England, was practically kidnapped and held under Despenser's thumb so he could control her vast estates. These attacks on women went against the noble codes that were supposed to guide behavior and only fueled the growing outrage against him. Perhaps the most shocking part was how Despenser treated the church and its leaders. Despite the medieval respect for religious figures, he showed no qualms about imprisoning bishops, seizing church lands, and twisting religious laws to fit his needs. When Bishop Adam Allerton of Hereford dared to speak out against royal policy, Despenser had him arrested and tortured. This sacrilegious behavior appalled everyone and added accusations of impiety to the growing list against him. The breaking point came when Queen Isabella, Edward III's wife and the daughter of the King of France, found herself pushed aside and humiliated by Despenser's control over her husband. The favorite showed clear disdain for the queen, blocking her from seeing Edward and systematically cutting down her household and finances. But Isabella wasn't a woman to be quietly brushed aside. In 1325, she was sent to France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV, over some disputed territories in Gascony. This diplomatic trip opened the door for her to take matters into her own hands. Isabella needed to break free from Despenser's control and start rallying resistance against his rule. Once she arrived in France, she began to gather support from English exiles and upset nobles fleeing Despenser's tyranny. Her cause gained significant traction when she teamed up with Roger Mortimer, one of the Marcher lords who had escaped Despenser's earlier purges. Isabella launched a clever propaganda campaign against Despenser. She portrayed herself as the wronged queen, exiled from her own kingdom due to her husband's favorite's unnatural influence. She highlighted Despenser's disregard for traditional laws, his attacks on the church, and his destruction of noble families. Most powerfully, she depicted him as a foreign corruption of English values, despite being born in England. Her message struck a chord with audiences across Europe who understood the dangers of royal favorites and the chaos they could cause. Isabella cast herself as the defender of legitimate government against oppression. This attracted support from nobles, merchants, and ordinary people who had suffered under Despenser's rule. By 1326, she had gathered an invasion force and was prepared to return to England. The invasion itself was almost underwhelming. When Isabella landed in Essex in September 1326, she was greeted as a liberator, not as an invader. The common folks, worn out from years of Despenser's oppression, rallied to her cause. Even more importantly, the nobles who had been too afraid to act before seized their chance for revenge and abandoned Edward II in droves. Edward II and Despenser fled westward toward Wales, hoping to find safety in areas where Hugh's influence was strongest. But even there, support dwindled as local leaders realized their future lay with the Queen, not with the fallen king and his favorite. The network of fear that had sustained Despenser's power turned out to be built on shaky ground when faced with real opposition. Hugh Despenser the Elder was the first to be captured. Isabella's forces nabbed him while he tried to defend Bristol Castle. His execution was quick but brutally harsh. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor. His head was displayed on London Bridge as a warning to others, but this was just a taste of what was to come when his son was caught. Hugh Despenser the Younger was finally caught near Llantrisant in Wales on November 16, 1326. By then, he was already shattered by the downfall of his power. The man who had struck fear across England for over 10 years was now just a quivering figure, said to have tried to end his life to avoid being captured. But his captors weren't about to let him off that easily. The decision about what to do with Dispenser was a foregone conclusion. However, the details of his execution needed careful planning. Queen Isabella and her allies knew this execution had to serve several purposes. It had to provide revenge for his many victims, deter future favorites from misusing their power, and symbolically cleanse the kingdom of his corruption. On November 24, 1326, Hugh Dispenser was taken to Hereford for his grand finale. The location was important. Hereford was where his power had peaked, and it was near Bishop Adam, one of his tortured victims. An immense crowd gathered, drawn not just by morbid fascination, but by a real thirst to see their oppressor meet his end. Dispenser didn't get the respect of a trial. Instead, his crimes were read out loud to the crowd. The list was long: treason, stealing royal lands, persecuting nobles, attacking the church, and corrupting the king's affections. Each accusation was met with cheers from the crowd, who had been waiting years for this moment of reckoning. The executioners had been carefully trained and approached their task like master craftsmen. This wasn't just going to be a simple beheading or hanging. It was a statement about the fate of those who corrupted the natural order of the kingdom. Every detail of the punishment was steeped in meaning, designed to maximize suffering while keeping him conscious. Dispenser was stripped naked and marched through the streets of Hereford, allowing onlookers to witness the reality of the man who had long terrorized them. Reduced from a powerful favorite to pitiful flesh, he became the target of mockery and scorn. Shouts filled the air, ridiculing his relationship with the king. The crowd watched in excitement as things took a dark turn. Dispenser was dragged through the streets, tied to a horse, his body slamming against the stones and rubble. This cruelty was meant to break him down physically while also entertaining the onlookers. By the time he reached the scaffold, he was bloodied and nearly out cold. But the worst was yet to come. Hugh Dispenser's execution was all about tearing apart his identity as a man, a nobleman, and a human being. First up was hanging, but not to death. The rope was carefully set to inflict pain, making him pass out without actually killing him. As he dangled there, gasping and choking, the crowd cheered and mocked the man who once held power over them. When they finally cut him down, he was alive but barely functioning. That's when things took an even worse turn. In a brutal twist mocking his supposed closeness with King Edward II, the executioners moved to castrate him, cutting off his genitals and tossing them into a fire. This wasn't just a brutal act. It symbolized the breaking of the corrupt bond between the king and his favorite, inflicting the deepest humiliation imaginable. Then came disembowelment. They sliced open Dispenser's abdomen, slowly pulling out his insides while he stayed conscious. Medieval medicine was strong enough to keep victims alive for this kind of torture, and the executioners knew how to extend the suffering. They even cut out his heart and tossed it into the flames, destroying the core of his treasonous thoughts. Through it all, Dispenser remained aware, his screams blending with the cheers of the crowd. Accounts from the time say he seemed to try to speak, maybe begging for mercy or trying for a last confession, but his words were drowned out by his agony and the crowd's excitement. The man who once commanded silence found himself completely unheard over his own suffering. The execution ended with the gruesome quartering of his body. His limbs were tied to horses and ripped away from his torso in a shocking display of violence. They severed his head, displaying it on London Bridge alongside his father's as a gruesome reminder of his fate. A warning for everyone else. Parts of his body got spread across different cities in England, making sure his downfall was seen throughout the kingdom. Right after Despenser was executed, there was a mix of celebration and clever politics at play. In Hereford, crowds partied late into the night, treating his death like a festival instead of a somber occasion. Songs and poems that mocked the dead favorite began to pop up everywhere, many of them boldly sexual, aimed at humiliating him even more. Queen Isabella wasted no time in solidifying her power and justifying her rebellion. Within weeks of Despenser's death, King Edward II had to step down for his young son, Edward III. With Isabella in charge as regent, the story became that she had saved England from the corruption brought by evil advisors and restored true governance. They spun Despenser's execution as a fair act of justice rather than mere vengeance. The psychological fallout of Despenser's death among the English nobility was deep and lasting. The brutal way he was executed served as a strong warning to any future royal favorites who might consider grabbing too much power. For years to come, courtiers would think about Hugh Despenser's fate before they tried to push their influence with weak kings. And the financial fallout, just as dramatic. His massive estates got handed over to Isabella's supporters, completely reshaping the power dynamics among the English nobility. Families that had suffered from his rule suddenly regained wealth and status, while those who sided with him faced ruin and exile. The international impact was big too. European courts watched Despenser's rise with both fascination and dread, and his execution was viewed as a win for legitimate governance over tyranny. Isabella's successful rebellion became a blueprint for other queens and nobles dealing with corrupt favorites and ineffective rulers. Hugh Despenser's execution left a legacy that stretches way beyond medieval England into the larger story of political violence and state power. His death stands as one of the most dramatic and symbolic executions in English history, meant not just to end a life, but to send a clear message about the dangers of overreaching. Ambition and the corruption that comes with royal power shaped his fate. The way he was executed, hanging, castration, disembowelment, and quartering, set a brutal standard for punishing traitors in England that lasted until the 1700s. His case became a reference point for future treason cases, embedding his suffering into the very fabric of English law. Historians argue about just how bad Despenser's crimes were and whether his punishment fit his wrongs. While few people defend his actions during his reign, many suggest that the extreme cruelty of his execution says as much about the vengeance of his enemies as it does about his own wickedness. The brutal way he died changed English political culture, making severe violence a standard tool for those in power. The sexual aspects of Despenser's punishment, especially his castration, show how medieval society viewed homosexuality and the perceived threats of unnatural relationships between men. His death stood as a cautionary tale about the risks of sexual deviance influencing political power, a theme that would pop up again in English history whenever royal favorites were thought to have close ties with their kings. We can't ignore the psychological impact of Despenser's execution. The details of his punishment suggest that his enemies wanted more than just his death. They craved his utter humiliation and destruction. This reflects the deep trauma and anger his oppressive reign caused among both the nobility and everyday people. When we think about the horrifying end of Hugh Despenser the Younger, we're faced with tough truths about power, justice, and human nature that still resonate today. His story highlights how quickly unchecked authority can twist individuals, even those privileged and educated, into monsters who see others merely as obstacles or tools to exploit. The cruelty of its execution challenges us to rethink our own ideas of justice and whether anyone, no matter their crimes, deserves such inhumane treatment. People's eager excitement to see someone suffer shows how dangerously enjoyable it can be to watch those we dislike get torn apart. The lessons from Despenser's rise and fall aren't just old news, they still matter today. His tale highlights how weak leadership opens the door for ambitious folks to gain power through manipulation and fear. As legal rules and traditions weakened, his tyranny grew, reminding us how fragile democracy and the rule of law can be. What's most unsettling is how Despenser's regime made extreme actions seem normal, using fear, corruption, and a slow creep toward cruelty. His victims often ended up playing a part in their own suffering, caught in a system that punished those who fought back even harder than those who went along. This shows how tyranny feeds on itself, twisting the morals of whole societies. The takeaway from Hugh Despenser's brutal downfall might be that the gap between civilization and savagery is much narrower than we want to admit. His execution, complete with all its medieval drama, was carried out by educated, supposedly Christian people convinced they were upholding justice. The way they so easily accepted brutal acts in the name of what they believed was right is a constant reminder of how capable humans are of doing evil, no matter the time or culture.